from the larynx, you're going to get into the lower respiratory tract. So let's look at this guy here. This blue tube right here is the trachea, and you can see the cartilaginous rings on this model right here. There's your trachea right there, the white with the cartilaginous rings. But the trachea comes down, and then in the thoracic cavity, it's going to split up into two primary tubes that go to each lung. You've got the, you call these the primary bronchi. One would be a primary bronchus. So this would be your right primary bronchus, this would be your left primary bronchus. And again, that just takes air, brings it down, and pushes it out to each one of your lungs. Now, if you look at your lungs, you need to be able to tell the difference between a right and left lung. And you notice that the heart is over here, and it's pushed more to the right, or excuse me, the left side of this body. So the right lung is always going to be larger than the left lung. The right lung also, if I can pull it off here without knocking the model down, the right lung also has three lobes. So you've got a superior lobe, a medial lobe, and an inferior lobe to the right lung. If you look at the left lung, it's only going to have two lobes. And again, you just have a superior and an inferior lobe on the left lung. But the reason that the left lung is smaller is because the heart is pushed more over to the left side, so it doesn't have as much room. So if you put this on the table, you know this has got to be the right lung because it's got three lobes. This has to be the left lung because it only has two lobes. Okay, the lungs are each covered with a membrane, which again, any kind of membrane that you have on the top of or surface of any organ is called a visceral membrane. So in this case, you would call it the visceral pleura, pleura referring to the lungs. So that would be the visceral pleura that surrounds the lungs. But then if you look at the cavity where the lungs sit, you call the membrane that lines this cavity the parietal pleura. And then between the parietal pleura and the visceral pleura, you're going to have a moist serous fluid in between those because this lung is expanding and contracting as you put air in there. You don't want friction just rubbing dry against dry. So you're going to have a serous fluid between the parietal and visceral membranes, and that's pleural fluid, which is inside the pleural cavity. So the pleural cavity would be the space between the parietal pleura and the visceral pleura. And again, that cuts down on friction. When these pleural membranes get inflamed and swollen and infected, you get something known as pleurisy. And you can imagine that pleurisy is very painful because you're going to feel it with every breath that you take because those membranes are irritated and rubbing up against each other. Also on this, it talks about the mediastinum. Remember, that's just this part of the thoracic cavity where the heart is, that's medial or middle cavity. Most of your teachers are not going to get real hung up on that right now. Remember in your respiratory tract, though, let's kind of go back up here. You're going to have, in the trachea, you're going to have cilia, which are little hair-like, finger-like projections that kind of wave things. And so you want everything, you don't want junk going down into your lungs. So those cilia are going to be constantly waving particles back up so you can either cough it out or swallow those particles. So cilia are hair-like projections on the mucosa of your respiratory tract. If you go back and look at the bronchi, your primary bronchi are going to start separating out into what we call secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchioles. So all of these little divisions here, let's just refer to those as bronchioles. You have to look on a slide in order to see the smaller and smaller divisions where you actually exchanged air. That's at the level of the alveoli, which are just little tiny gas pockets. So let me just run up on the board and show you that. Cut. Okay, if you look as the primary bronchi that go to each lung, they start breaking up into smaller and smaller bronchioles, and it's just like an upside down tree where it just branches more and more. Finally, you're going to get to something known as the respiratory bronchiole, and that's where you start the gas exchange. It breaks up into these little grape-like balls here. They shouldn't have this little curly stuff on them. Just little grape-like balls. And each one of these little grapes right here is known as an alveolus. Plural, it would be alveoli. So there's many alveoli. So each one of these little alveoli are a thin, simple squamous membrane, and that's where actual gas exchange is going to occur between capillaries that will be lining right along there, and then your lung tissue right there. So gas exchange actually occurs at this level of the alveolus. Now, each one of the alveoli open up into a central area here known as the alveolar sac. And I guess that's about all you need to know on that part.